I never expected that a simple holistic retreat would completely transform my life. But that's exactly what happened when I signed up for a week-long tantric yoga program in the mountains of Northern California. The brochure had promised spiritual awakening and deep connection, but I was mostly looking for a break from my hectic life in San Francisco. As a 32-year-old graphic designer who spent most days hunched over a computer, the idea of stretching my body while surrounded by nature seemed like the perfect antidote to my digital existence. What I didn't anticipate was being paired with another participant for the more intimate practices, or how that pairing would awaken parts of myself I'd kept dormant for years. When I arrived at the Serenity Springs Retreat Center, I was immediately struck by the beauty of the place. Nestled among towering redwoods with views of misty valleys below, the center consisted of a collection of wooden buildings with large windows that seemed to invite nature inside. The main yoga studio had floor-to-ceiling glass on 3 sides, making it feel like you were practicing in the forest itself. The accommodations were simple but comfortable private cabins with minimal furnishings, encouraging guests to spend their time in communal spaces or outdoors rather than isolated in their rooms. On the first evening, all 20 participants gathered in the main hall for orientation. The retreat leader, Indira, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and remarkable posture, explained the philosophy behind Tantric yoga. Contrary to Western misconceptions, she said with a knowing smile, Tantra is not primarily about sex. It's about connection to yourself, to others, to the universe. The word Tantra literally means to weave or to expand. Through these practices, we weave together the physical and spiritual aspects of our being, expanding our consciousness beyond the limitations of our everyday minds. I nodded along, trying to appear open-minded while secretly wondering if I'd made a mistake. I'd always considered myself spiritual but not religious, open to new experiences but skeptical of anything that seemed too new age. And then Indira dropped the bombshell. For many of our practices, you'll be working with a partner. This creates a container for deeper exploration and helps us break through the isolation that characterizes modern life. My stomach tightened. I'd somehow missed this detail when registering. The thought of doing intimate yoga practices with a stranger made me profoundly uncomfortable. I glanced around the room, assessing my potential partners. The group was diverse in age and background, with slightly more women than men. I wondered how the pairings would be determined and whether I could somehow influence the process. Don't worry, Indira continued, as if reading my thoughts. We'll start slowly, building trust before moving into more advanced practices. And you'll be paired with someone who matches your experience level and energy. She smiled reassuringly, but I wasn't convinced. That night, I barely slept, torn between the urge to pack my bags and the desire to push through my discomfort. Wasn't that why I'd come here in the first place, to challenge myself? The next morning, after a silent breakfast of oatmeal and fresh fruit, we gathered in the studio for our first session. Indira announced that she had intuitively created the partnerships based on her initial impressions of our energies. When I call your names, please find each other and claim a space in the room. I held my breath as she worked through the list. Finally, she called, Michael and Elijah. I raised my hand, and across the room, a man about my age did the same. As we made eye contact, I felt a strange flutter in my chest. Elijah was tall and lean, with warm brown skin and closely cropped hair. He wore simple black yoga pants and a fitted gray t-shirt that revealed toned arms covered in intricate tattoos. When he smiled at me, his entire face lit up, creating deep dimples in his cheeks. Hey, he said as we claimed a spot near the windows. First time doing tantric yoga? That obvious, huh? I replied, trying to mask my nervousness with humor. I can practically see the flight or fight response happening, he laughed. Don't worry, I was the same way my first time. But I promise it's worth pushing through the initial discomfort. So you've done this before? I asked, simultaneously relieved and intimidated. A few workshops, nothing extensive. I'm still very much a beginner, he assured me. But I've learned that the key is to breathe through the awkwardness. And to remember that everyone else is just as self-conscious as you are. His words calmed me slightly, and when Indira instructed us to sit cross-legged, facing our partners, I managed to meet Elijah's gaze without completely panicking. We'll start with a simple exercise, she said. Just look into your partner's eyes for 3 minutes without speaking. This might sound easy, but you'll be surprised how challenging it can be to maintain eye contact without distracting yourself. She was right. As I looked into Elijah's dark brown eyes, I felt exposed, as if he could see every insecurity, every fear, every desire I'd ever had. My instinct was to look away, to make a joke, to do anything to break the intensity of the moment. But I forced myself to stay present, to breathe through the discomfort just as he had suggested. Gradually, something shifted. The awkwardness didn't disappear entirely, but it receded enough for me to notice other things. The flecks of gold in Elijah's irises, the way his expression softened as we continued to look at each other, the subtle synchronization of our breathing that happened without conscious effort. When Indira finally rang a small bell to signal the end of the exercise, I felt as if I'd just run a marathon, exhausted but exhilarated. "How was that for you?" Elijah asked softly. "Intense," I admitted, but not in a bad way. "Just more than I expected." He nodded. "That's Tantra for you. It takes ordinary experiences and amplifies them by bringing full awareness to them." The rest of that first session consisted of relatively simple partner poses, seated back-to-back breathing, gentle assisted stretches, basic hand positions called mudras that we practiced together. Nothing too intimidating, though even these elementary exercises created a surprising sense of intimacy. By lunchtime, I felt more comfortable with Elijah, impressed by his respectful approach to the practice and his ability to put me at ease with well-timed humor. Over the next few days, our practices gradually became more involved. We learned to synchronize our breathing while holding challenging poses together, to support each other's weight in counterbalanced positions, to communicate without words through subtle adjustments of pressure and resistance. Each session built upon the previous one, slowly increasing the level of trust and connection required. Outside of class, Elijah and I often found ourselves gravitating toward each other. During mealtimes, we'd share stories about our lives back home. I learned that he was a physical therapist who specialized in working with dancers and athletes, that he had grown up in Philadelphia with 4 sisters, that he played bass in a jazz band on weekends. I told him about my design work, my small apartment with 2 mini houseplants, my dream of someday illustrating children's books. "What brought you to a tantric yoga retreat?" I asked him on the third evening as we sat on the deck watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. He was quiet for a moment, considering. "Honestly, a breakup. A pretty bad one. My partner of 3 years ended things 6 months ago, and I've been struggling to move forward. A friend who did this retreat last year said it helped her process some old emotional wounds, so I thought it might do the same for me." "I'm sorry about your breakup," I said, touched by his vulnerability. He shrugged. "It's for the best, ultimately. We wanted different things. But it's left me questioning a lot about how I approach relationships, about what intimacy really means." He turned to look at me. "What about you? What brings you here?" I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "Something similar, I guess. Not a recent breakup, but a pattern of keeping people at a distance. I'm good at the beginning stages of relationships, the excitement, the discovery. But when things start to get real, when true intimacy is required, I tend to find reasons to walk away." I hadn't planned to be so honest, but something about Elijah invited confidences. "And you thought tantric yoga might help with that?" he asked, not judgmentally, just curious. "I didn't actually know what tantric yoga involved when I signed up," I admitted with a laugh. "The retreat was recommended by my therapist, who thought some kind of body work might help me connect with emotions I've been intellectualizing. But now that I'm here, yes, I think it might be exactly what I needed." Our conversation was interrupted by the dinner bell, but something had shifted between us. Our shared vulnerabilities had created a deeper bond, one that manifested in our yoga practice the following day. As we moved through the increasingly complex poses, there was a new level of trust, a willingness to surrender to the experience without the hesitation that had characterized our earlier sessions. It was on the 5th day that we encountered the practice that would change everything. Indira gathered us in the studio after lunch, the room warm and fragrant with incense. "Today, we'll be working with a powerful technique for releasing stored emotions and energy," she explained. "It's called dynamic meditation, and it involves vigorous movement, including shaking, to break through physical and emotional blockages." She demonstrated, standing with feet hip-width apart, knees slightly bent, allowing her body to shake from the ground up. The movement looked strange, almost seizure-like, her limbs vibrating with increasing intensity as she surrendered to the sensation. "The key is to let go of control," she said. "Allow the movement to come from deep within your body, not from your mind. Your partner is there to create a safe space for your expression and to witness your process without judgment. I glanced at Elijah, apprehension evident in my expression. This seemed far more vulnerable than anything we'd done so far. One person would shake while the other observed, then we would switch roles. There would be nowhere to hide, no way to maintain the composed facade I typically presented to the world. It's okay to be nervous, Elijah said quietly as we found our spot. I am too. But remember what Indira said on the first day, the discomfort is where the growth happens. You go first, I suggested, needing a moment to prepare myself. He nodded, moving to the center of our mat while I sat cross-legged at the edge. Indira put on music with a strong, primal beat, encouraging everyone to close their eyes and feel the rhythm. At first, Elijah's movements were hesitant, his body swaying slightly as if testing the waters. But gradually, he surrendered to the process. His shaking became more pronounced, starting in his legs and moving upward through his torso, arms, and eventually his entire body. What struck me most was the transformation in his face. The controlled expression he usually wore gave way to something raw and unguarded. Tears streamed down his cheeks as his body convulsed, releasing what looked like years of pent-up emotion. I watched, transfixed, honored to witness such a profound moment of vulnerability. When the music shifted to a softer melody, signaling the end of the active phase, Elijah's movements gradually slowed. He stood still for a moment, eyes closed, tears still wet on his face, before sinking to his knees on the mat. Without thinking, I moved toward him, placing a gentle hand on his back. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "for seeing me." We sat in silence for a few minutes as the room quieted, other participants also transitioning from active shaking to stillness. Then it was my turn. We switched positions, Elijah sitting at the edge of the mat while I stood in the center, feeling exposed and uncertain. "You don't have to do anything," he assured me. "Just allow whatever wants to move through you." The music began again, the same primal beat filling the room. I closed my eyes, trying to connect with the rhythm, to let go of the self-consciousness that kept my body rigid. Nothing happened at first. I swayed awkwardly, feeling foolish and frustrated. "It's okay to shake," Elijah said softly. "It's okay to let go." Something in his words penetrated the wall I'd built around myself. I remembered how courageously he had surrendered to the process, how beautiful his vulnerability had been. And suddenly, as if a dam had broken, my body began to tremble. The movement started in my legs, a slight vibration that gradually intensified, spreading upward through my hips, my stomach, my chest, my shoulders, until my entire being was shaking uncontrollably. With the physical release came an emotional one. Tears filled my eyes as sensations I'd long suppressed rushed to the surface. Grief for relationships I'd sabotaged, anger at myself for running from intimacy, fear of being truly seen, and underneath it all, a profound longing for connection. I was dimly aware of Elijah's presence, a steady, compassionate witness to my unraveling. When the shaking finally subsided, I felt simultaneously emptied and filled, as if I'd released years of stagnant energy to make space for something new. I opened my eyes to find Elijah looking at me with such tenderness that fresh tears spilled down my cheeks. "That was beautiful," he said, offering me a hand as I lowered myself to the mat beside him. "Thank you for trusting me enough to let go." We sat together in silence as Indira guided the group through a brief meditation to integrate the experience. I felt raw, exposed, but also strangely peaceful. Something fundamental had shifted, not just in my relationship with Elijah, but in my relationship with myself. That evening, as we sat on a secluded part of the deck watching stars appear in the darkening sky, Elijah turned to me. "Can I tell you something?" he asked, his voice quiet but clear. "Of course," I replied, drawing my knees to my chest. When I was shaking today, when all that emotion was coming up, I had this moment of clarity. I realized that part of why my last relationship failed was because I never fully showed up. I was always holding something back, protecting myself. He paused, looking out at the silhouettes of trees against the night sky. And I realized I don't want to do that anymore. I don't want to hide. His words resonated deeply with my own experience. "I know exactly what you mean," I said. "For me, it's always been easier to keep people at a certain distance. to show them the parts of myself I think they want to see, but never the whole truth. I took a deep breath. But today, when I was shaking, when I completely lost control, and you were just there, witnessing it without judgment, it made me think that maybe being fully seen isn't as terrifying as I've always believed. Elijah reached for my hand, his fingers warm against mine. "There's something happening between us," he said, not a question but a statement. "I feel it, and I think you do too." My heart raced, fear and excitement mingling in my chest. This was usually the moment when I would retreat, make a joke, change the subject. Anything to avoid the vulnerability of acknowledging a genuine connection. But the day's practice had cracked something open in me, making it impossible to resort to my usual defenses. "I do feel it," I admitted, squeezing his hand. "And it scares me." "Me too," he said, his honesty disarming. "But maybe that's okay. Maybe the fear is just part of it." We sat in silence for a while, hands intertwined, the weight of possibility between us. There was no rush to define what was happening, no pressure to make declarations or decisions. Just a mutual recognition of connection and a willingness to explore it, however tentatively. The final 2 days of the retreat brought even deeper practices. We learned techniques for circulating energy between our bodies, for creating sacred space through ritual touch, for communicating desires and boundaries with clarity and respect. Each exercise brought us closer, not just physically but emotionally and spiritually as well. On the last morning, Indira led the group in a culminating practice that synthesized everything we had learned throughout the week. As Elijah and I moved together, our bodies finding natural harmony, I experienced a sense of integration I'd never known before, as if the various parts of myself that had always felt fragmented were finally coming together into a coherent whole. "This is just the beginning," Indira reminded us as we sat in a closing circle. "The real practice happens when you return to your daily lives, when you apply these principles of presence, connection, and authentic expression to your relationships and work." As the group dispersed to pack and prepare for departure, Elijah and I lingered in the studio, reluctant to break the spell of the past week. "So," he said, a mixture of hope and uncertainty in his voice, "what happens now?" It was the question I'd been avoiding, the one that would normally send me running. But something had changed. The practices had given me a taste of what was possible when I allowed myself to be vulnerable, to be seen, to connect without hiding. And I didn't want to lose that. "I live in San Francisco, you live in Oakland," I said, stating the geographical facts as if they were the most relevant consideration. "That's not exactly long distance." A slow smile spread across his face. "No, it's not. Bart makes it pretty manageable, actually. And I happen to know this great little jazz club in North Beach that might be looking for a bassist," I continued, returning his smile. "Is that so?" he said, moving closer. "And would you be willing to show me this club sometime?" "I think that could be arranged," I replied, my heart racing as he reached for my hand. We exchanged phone numbers and made tentative plans for the following weekend, both of us navigating the transition from retreat partners to something more with a mixture of excitement and caution. As we parted at the parking lot, Elijah pulled me into a hug that felt both familiar and thrillingly new. "Thank you," he whispered against my hair, "for shaking with me." I laughed at his choice of words, but I understood the deeper meaning behind them. In allowing ourselves to shake, literally and metaphorically, we had broken through barriers that had kept us isolated, creating space for a connection that felt both unexpected and somehow inevitable. Driving back to San Francisco, winding down the coastal highway with the windows open and salt air filling my lungs, I reflected on the transformation of the past week. I had arrived at the retreat seeking a break from routine, perhaps some physical relaxation and minor spiritual insights. I was leaving with something far more profound, a new relationship with myself, a deeper understanding of intimacy, and the beginning of a connection with Elijah that held possibilities I was finally ready to explore. The practices we had learned, the eye-gazing, the synchronized breathing, the supported poses, and yes, the shaking, had created a foundation of trust and vulnerability that seemed to compress months of normal relationship development into a single week. But I knew that the real work was just beginning. Maintaining that openness in the context of everyday life, with its stresses and distractions, would be the true test. As I crossed the Golden Gate Bridge, The familiar skyline of San Francisco appearing through the fog, I made a silent commitment to myself. I would not retreat into old patterns of avoidance and self-protection. I would continue to practice presence and vulnerability, not just with Elijah, but in all my relationships. I would remember the feeling of being fully seen and accepted, using it as a touchstone when fear threatened to overwhelm me. The Tantric practices had shown me that true intimacy, whether physical, emotional, or spiritual, requires a willingness to be present with both pleasure and discomfort, to breathe through intensity rather than escaping it, to allow oneself to be transformed by connection rather than remaining safely isolated. It was a lesson that extended far beyond yoga or romance, touching every aspect of human experience. As I pulled into the parking garage of my apartment building, my phone buzzed with a text from Elijah, "Made it home. Already missing our practice. Looking forward to creating new ones together." I smiled, typing back, "Me too. And yes to new practices. Maybe even some that involve shaking." His response came quickly, "Definitely shaking. It's where the magic happens." And in that moment, I knew with certainty that whatever developed between us, whether a brief connection or something lasting, it would be authentic, grounded in mutual respect and a shared willingness to be vulnerable. The retreat had given us tools not just for yoga but for life, for love, for the messy, beautiful process of human connection. As I carried my suitcase up to my apartment, I felt lighter somehow, as if I'd left behind not just the stress of work, but the weight of old defenses, old fears, old limitations. The week of Tantric yoga had shaken me, literally and figuratively, awakening parts of myself I hadn't known existed and creating space for new possibilities. And for the first time in years, perhaps ever, I wasn't afraid of what might come next. I was ready to shake, to surrender, to connect. I was ready to begin. Total _char_count, 18,738.